National Legislation Director for DAV. Joe has been in this position for the last 20 years and is hanging it up at the end of the month, so he was gracious enough to come along and talk to me about his career. Before we get into that, I just want to make a couple house cleaning notes. First, if you have any technical difficulties, you should have a box on the right-hand side that allows you to do a chat message. Please contact us there so we can see if you can help. Also in that same area is a questions box. I think it's actually the same box. If you have any questions along the way about what we're talking about, please put it in there and we can throw the question out there. But moving back to where we are. So Joe, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your current position. What have you been doing? What is the National Legislative Director?
Well, good afternoon, Matt. National Legislative Director for DAV basically is the in-house lobbyist, dealing with Congress, dealing with the federal government, and we also do the grassroots operation. So whatever a lobbyist does, that's what I do.
So with VA in particular, are you working just on the Hill? Are you in Washington? Where all are you as far as you're concentrating your efforts?
On the Hill, at the Department of Veterans Affairs, to a lesser degree at the Department of Labor, and Department of Defense.
What are you doing over the Department of Labor?
For veterans employment programs, they have vets over there, Veterans Education and Training Services, that's run out of Department of Labor.
Mm-hmm.
DOD, our dealings with them are mostly transitional dealings, the separation exams and the likes.
Well, let's before we jump into the legislative director aspect, let's kind of look back on your history and basically the road you took to get there. You start at the beginning or retrace or wherever you want to go here.
Well, back in 1969, I made a decision that I was going to invest 3 years in the United States Marine Corps, and it's still paying dividends today. It was probably one of the better moves that I made in my life. I was not a very good student in high school, and college proved to be even worse. So I dropped out, enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1969, actually the day after Easter, April 11th of 1969.
Wow. So that was those are two decisions made at the same time. You're dropping out and enlisting, or you
Yes.
dropped out and kind of, okay.
No, those are at the same time. I had a neighbor who was killed on December 2nd, 1968. And so when I came home for Christmas, his body was just getting back from Vietnam. I went to the services. When I went back to school in January of '69, my heart wasn't in it. I felt I needed to be somewhere else, and as the semester progressed, it was clear that I needed to be somewhere else.
And so did you go in? Well, where did you serve when you were in the Marines?
Because I was going to school at the University of Dayton in Ohio, at that time they were rotating each month where you went to boot camp. Mm-hmm. 1 month was Parris Island, the next month was San Diego. I happened to catch San Diego. I went through boot camp in San Diego, then went to infantry training following that, and then advanced infantry training after that. Came home on leave for 20 days, and then went back through what we called staging, 2 weeks of training, intense training on what to expect in Vietnam, and after that got shipped out.
Over to Vietnam?
Yes.
And how long were you there?
A total of 5 months.
Okay.
And spent some time in Okinawa with 3rd Marine Division there. And when I came back to the States, I was a marksmanship instructor down at Parris Island.
Huh. Well, with Vietnam, 5 months is an atypical tour. What?
Yes.
Talk to us about.
The unit was pulled out, and so I was fortunate enough to leave after 5 months. But we went back on battalion landing teams, set off the coast for the Army's invasion of Cambodia. Mm-hmm. They had us sitting there just in case there were problems. Nothing arose. The Army was able to take care of that invasion on their own, and so then we sailed around for a while and went back to Okinawa.
Okay. And you got out and kind of traveled around for a while, and then what? I take it you got out. You had no direct interest in the military or VA.
Well, you know, it was interesting. They were talking to me about becoming an officer, and it sounded good. They wanted to send me to school under a Navy program. I forget what the acronym was now, but they wanted me to major in mathematics. I didn't want to major in mathematics. I was going to get out and do the Marine Corps platoon leadership program because I was accepted to college and got out and decided, wow, this is a great life. I don't really want to go back in. So I went back to school, back in New Jersey, St. Peter's College, and transferred out to the University of New Mexico, where I graduated, and thought about going back in the reserves then, and decided against that. I was cramming to fit 2 years of college into one, and so I was taking 24 units both semesters, so I wanted to graduate early, and I don't know why. There was no jobs available, but that's my story.
And so what, to me, I look at your history and you kind of go through all these different, I don't know if you call them phases, but you've seen the VA from various angles. So the next one, we get to the 80s, and what was going on there?
Well, in 1985, I was in private practice out in California. I graduated law school back in 1980 and went out on my own and was getting involved in veterans issues at that time, and came back to Washington, D.C. in 83, the year after the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated, to stand vigil at the wall for POW MIAs, and set up a lot of meetings with our elected officials to meet with them, and got the bug, said I want to come back to D.C., and went back to California and saw an article in a DAV magazine talking about the Board of Veterans Appeals looking to hire disabled vets who are attorneys, and on the off chance, I sent in my resume. I got a job interview, and was hired by the board in May of 1985. At that time, it was still the Veterans Administration, had become department level, and worked at the board when the board sections were 3-member board members. And in my section, we had 2 attorneys and a doctor who looked at cases. We dealt mostly with psychiatric disabilities, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia.
And back then, the board was it, right? There was no...
There was no court.
You had nowhere to go.
If we said black was white, black was white. Veteran, unfortunately, didn't have any options other than to ask for reconsideration, and in most cases, reconsideration, you know, even when they were granted, they were never changed, because board members kind of looked at it as, if I overturn this board's, you know, decision, they're going to turn around and come back at me. So it was very rare back then to have a decision overturned on reconsideration. Then in 1990, or actually 89, the court came into existence, and DAV was looking to hire, and I decided to go to DAV and represent veterans before the new court.
And so tell me about your experiences at the board. Was there anything that sticks in your mind?
Yeah, there was a lot of things that irritated me. And again, I came to Washington with the thought that I was going to be able to help veterans. And I found out quickly that that wasn't going to be the case, because I was writing decisions for 3 board members. I would only get credit for those decisions that they signed off on. And after a while, you had a feeling for what they would sign off on, and sometimes you try to push the envelope. Most times it wouldn't work, and so in many cases I left in the evening very frustrated about what I had to do. And you know, one case in particular that really stands out to this day was the case. I was at the board for less than 3 months, and it was what we call the blade. It was probably about 1/4 of an inch thick, and it was IR scars of the thumb and the index finger. He was 10% for a painful scar of the thumb and 0% on the index finger. when I opened it up and started reading it, he had both the index finger and the thumb amputated at the first digit. And so I looked at that and I thought, how could this be? You know, how could he only have a painful scar? Where's the amputation come in? And I read through the file and read through it again to try to figure out why he wasn't service connected for the amputation, and there was no clear answer. He was a Navy drill press operator, lopped off the top of both of those fingers in the Navy. So I wrote up this great decision, taking him from 10% to 50% because it was his major hand. And that case sat in the board's office for probably about 3 or 4 months, and finally the law member came out and said, you can't do this. And I said, what do you mean I can't do this? I said, it's an amputation. He said, I know, but you know, the regional office screwed up. They need to correct their mistake. Remand it back to the regional office, and at that time we called it IRPATH. I can't remember what it stood for, but it was a little, you know, description before the remand portion indicating that we wanted a doctor to opine whether or not this was an amputation. Very frustrating. To this day, I don't know if they ever granted that guy his full benefits or not. I mean, those are the type of frustrating things you saw. You know, especially with PTSD. Back then, I had a veteran, Bronze Star in Korea, Silver Star in Vietnam, wounded in both wars, had a diagnosis of personality disorder, and couldn't get a diagnosis. They had a board of 2. And again, it was personality disorder, and it was very frustrating to see this combat veteran with a, you know, a tour in Korea and a tour in Vietnam being denied for PTSD. So those things were very frustrating to see. And when the court came into existence, it was an eye-opener.
It was exciting to, it sounds like, jump to the other side of actually directly helping vets.
And you know, the interesting thing too back then was I took the arguments that the service officers had made in cases that I had handled at the board. And one sticks out to me this day. It was a reduction in 100%. And the DAV appeals officer cited to 3.343 or 44 or both, I can't remember now. But I read it and I said, oh my God, they can't reduce this guy. And again, I wrote up this decision that I thought was pretty good, reinstating his 100%. And again, the law member came in and said, you can't do this. And I said, but I mean, look at this. You can't reduce this guy. I said, not if you look at what's stated in the regulations. And he says, well, just put in there that the representative, you know, argued 3.344 and then deny it. And so when I got to the court, I had a case. It was 100%, 19 and a half years, goes in for an examination, and he's reduced to 10%. He had a psychiatric disability, and they reduced it based on the fact that he would go to his brother-in-law's body shop and sit there and watch them work, and the rating board felt that that was sufficient, that if he could do that, he could work. And I made the argument to the court that this was a rating reduction, because the board would always terminate it as increased rating. Right. And also argued 3.344, and Judge Steinberg happened to be the judge on that case, and he agreed, you know, these are not increased rating cases, these are rating reduction cases, and applied 3.344 and said, you know, clearly there was no evidence to demonstrate an increase or you know, that his condition had gotten better, so he was reinstated to the 100%.
So that was, I can only imagine that was nice to be able to go from suggesting to help vets from inside the VA to actually getting the right result at the court.
It was, and you know, back then it was like shooting fish in a barrel. There was no case law. We were making the case law as we went, and general counsel really had no background in Title 38. I can remember one of the arguments they made in a case where the veteran was claiming service connection for migraine headaches. In their brief, they argued that, so what? Even if he had migraine headaches in service, the only thing VA recognized, he had cluster headaches.
Okay.
Cluster headaches in service. They said, so what if he had cluster headaches? The only thing VA recognizes is migraine headaches under 8100. So we had to clear that up with the court, that analogous ratings, and they were unaware that
analogous ratings is something they promulgated through their regulations.
Correct.
Yeah. So the general counsel's unaware of their own.
They were unaware of that. They were unaware of the fact that out in the field, VA had M21 that were directives from central office, and they told the court there was nothing that came out from central office to the regional offices. Judge Kramer sat up on the bench and made the announcement holding up one of the books that he was given that book that morning by the DAV that shows that there was communications between central office and the field. So, again, back then it was a lot different than I'm sure it is now. I haven't been following the court as closely as I would like, but I know now with case law, you're looking at these things a lot differently than we did back then.
Definitely not making the same case law now, but unfortunately the remand rate I think is still over, or the error rate I guess you'd say is still around or over 50%, which is unfortunate that we're, 20 years, 27 years out. Well, so you weren't there for what, 2-3 years before you went over on the legislative side?
2.5 years. I got called into DAV headquarters by then Executive Director Jesse Brown, who later became Secretary Jesse Brown, and he offered me the position on the legislative staff, and my first thoughts were, oh my God, I don't know anything about legislation. I feel comfortable doing what I'm doing, but you don't say no to Jesse, and I didn't have to move or go anywhere, just transfer over to their headquarters. And right after the elections in '92, I started working on the legislative staff.
Did you have a mentor there? How did you jump in and get your?
One of the associate legislative directors, who I was very close with, we were in the same chapter, so we knew each other very well. He was on the staff. In fact, he was the one that recommended that I come on staff. He was my mentor. He was a Vietnam vet, a double-leg amputee, and he would take me up to the Hill whenever he went up there, meeting with the people he was meeting with, and introduced me around, sat there for his hearings and saw what he had to do, and he helped me with the testimony. So I was trained by someone who had been on the legislative staff for a number of years, probably about 10 at that point.
And it wasn't very long, 2-3 years, 2.5 years. You went from that position to the executive council.
I was legislative counsel for about 4 years, and then became the deputy.
Okay.
And then a short time after that, it was less than a year, I was made the legislative director.
Okay. Okay. And so and then we're what, 20 years? Coming on 20 years. You're doing that, 22.
Almost, yeah, 18 years as legislative director, 22 years on the legislative staff, 23, almost 23.
Okay. Well, I look back and talking to other folks about legislation you're involved in, and as you say, some of the stuff that didn't happen is almost as important as that which did get passed. And we don't have to talk about all these issues, but what stands out to you as far as some of the bills or?
Probably the most interesting one that stands out to this day for me was the duty to assist legislation. Back, I don't even remember what year it was, the court basically stood the VA's duty to assist on its head. It said that the duty to assist didn't come into existence until a veteran showed an in-service injury, a nexus, and a current condition. And it was like, at that point, why do you need VA to assist?
Right.
You've already established everything you need to establish. And so the only way to correct that was to go to Congress. And we went to Congress. We found a champion in Senator Patty Murray. She introduced legislation that reinstated the duty to assist. And we were having a hard time getting it through the Senate. For some reason, it wasn't moving, and I was getting frustrated. And I happened to talk to Tony Principi, who was in between his stints as secretary. He had finished up his first tour under the first Bush and hadn't come in yet under the second Bush. And he suggested I reach out to Senator McCain's staff, talk to them.
And why would that be atypical for you to do that?
Well, Senator McCain was on armed services. And so I had a close friend in McCain's office, and we talked, and, you know, it was like, well, I mean, this is veterans, we deal with, you know, military, and so we came up with former members of the military. And that's how Senator McCain was able to introduce it on an armed services bill. And he had a fight with Senator John Warner, who was chairman of the committee, to get his provision added to the DOD authorization bill. And at that point, Senator Murray was a little upset, or at least her staff was, that this was introduced by someone else and was moving when her bill was you know, kind of stagnant in the Veterans Affairs Committee. And then when it actually did get added to the Defense Authorization Bill, the Chairman Specter, was irate. So now I'm getting calls from Murray staff and from Specter staff saying, you got to get McCain to back off of this. And I called up his staff, and they just laughed and said, you know how hard he fought to get Warner to allow him to get it in there, and now you want him to pull it? There's no way it's going to happen. So that legislation was enacted into law, and for maybe about a month, the duty to assist in a very simple form existed in law. Specter then passed legislation that now not only became the duty to assist, but the duty to notify, had a lot of other provisions in there. And one of the things it did was to void the McCain legislation. So it took that out and replaced it with what we now have today. And it was just fascinating to watch the mechanics of that work and watch the egos that were involved in this whole process.
And I imagine some tight dancing on your part by
very much so, trying to make sure we weren't burning any bridges, and everyone understood it was all we wanted to do was to make sure veterans, you know, had that ability to get the assistance of VA when they were working with their claims.
Well, a couple other things that stuck out to me. First was concurrent receipt. I think people look at that now, and there's still work to be done to get full, get rid of full offset. So concurrent receipt is basically being able to receive military retirement and VA benefits, and that has been phased in over the last several years. But my understanding is that was a long fight. It took quite a long time for that actually to come about.
It took a very long time, and you know, this is an area that shows just what Congress can do when they don't want to do the right thing. You know, I mean, concurrent receipt, the argument has always been those members of the military that spent 20 or more years on active duty earn that retired pay. They also, if they were injured or wounded or disabled, became ill as a result of that active duty, were entitled to disability compensation. Two were separate and distinct. Right? They were, you know, they were in no way connected, but the law prevented a veteran from getting both. So the argument was just decouple it.
Right. You
know, allow them to get their retired pay, allow them to get their disability compensation. Well, to avoid that, Congress passed, which became special disability compensation. It provided a stipend of $100 a month. Someone rated, I think, 70 and 80% disabled. $200 a month if you were rated 90%, and $300 a month if you were 100%. So it became basically like a compensation program. So they weren't taxed on that money,
right?
Tax-free, instead of their, you know, getting their retired pay, which would be taxable. Well, that lasted for a couple of years, and then no one was happy with it. Congress came up with, I think it was called combat-related special pay, that allowed an individual who had combat disabilities to receive that compensation as part of their retired pay. So they would get that from their retired pay as well as their disability comp. Again, people still were not happy. It made no sense what they were doing. And finally, they decided to then provide concurrent receipt for those veterans rated 50% or higher. So regardless of how your injuries or illnesses came about, whether it was combat or non-combat, you were able to get both your retired pay and your disability compensation if you were 50% or higher. It was a 10-year phase-in, which I think ended in 2014.
Well, I mean, what did that look like from the inside, though? Because it sounds like every Congress you got, not necessarily where you wanted to be, but farther away from where you were and maybe closer as far as, you know, the increment.
And that's exactly right. I mean, everyone kept coming back, fighting for what we believed in, concurrent receipt, to earn and separate benefits. And that's all we wanted Congress to recognize. It took a while. It took a fight. My biggest concern was because we were doing it for 50% and higher that we wouldn't get it for 40% and below, because we wouldn't have the momentum, we wouldn't have the interest, and I think that proved correct. That, you know, those people at 50% or higher went away, and those now rated 40% and below, I doubt are ever going to see a concurrent receipt because of the monetary cost of that program and Congress' unwillingness to spend that kind of money.
Well, tell me, we talked before about legislation that got deep six, that got you know, stopped, and being a very good thing. One that I saw or you had mentioned was the Veterans Improvement Act. Sounds good on its face.
Yeah, that was a very interesting bill. I mean, it was introduced in 1993, and it was introduced by two strong veterans advocates. At the time, it was chairman of the Benefits Subcommittee, Chairman Slattery from Kansas, and Mike Bilirakis from Florida. And that bill is very interesting. I was asked to write the testimony for my boss, the then legislative director. And as I'm reading through the legislation, I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is a bad piece of legislation. It said that for clear and unmistakable error, the retro would only go back for 10 years. So if the error was made in 1940 and, you know, this is 1990, you're only getting 10 years of retro, not 50. It made no sense. You know, why would you penalize a veteran for a mistake that VA is making? It also had a provision in there that allowed the chairman of the board to keep and decide the disposition of appeals, which we thought was a little bit over the top for a chairman to have that kind of control of decisions. It allowed or it restricted duty to assist, benefit of the doubt, and also changed the burden of proof, making it harder for veterans to meet that burden of proof. And you know, it's one of those bills where when you look at it, you scratch your head and say, how could you call this an improvement?
Well, so was the bill already, they already had drafted?
It was introduced. It was scheduled to be discussed at a hearing, an upcoming hearing. And so I went into my mentor and said to him, hey, this is a bad bill. I mean, there's nothing in here that's very good for veterans. It's all one-sided. It was to try to speed the process up, but again, by speeding the process up, you were hurting veterans, making it easier for VA. And so he said, well, let's go in and talk to the director. We went in there, we had this conversation about how bad this legislation was, and the thought was, well, let's call the staffer on the Hill that, you know, is responsible for this and talk to him. So we call him up, and first words out of my mentor's mouth was, John, this is a bad bill. And John said, well, what do you like about it? And he said, well, the title's nice, the Improvement of Veterans Benefits and Appeals Act, but other than that, it was terrible. So it was interesting because I think all the organizations had the same feeling on the bill. This is bad. And again, this chairman was a very strong veterans advocate. It was introduced. The chairman of the board at the time, I won't mention his name, but the chairman of the board at the time put the blame on the staff director of the subcommittee. Staff director blamed the chairman of the board that these are his ideas. And what happened was the bill was pulled from the hearing, never saw the light of day. So it was a good thing for veterans.
Wow. It sounds like a, what do you call it, wolf in lamb's clothing.
Exactly.
One of the things that from my understanding, you really passionate about and got behind after 9/11 was, I think it was called Stand Up for Veterans campaign, or
yes.
Can you talk about what that was? And
that came about because of a grant from an anonymous donor who, my understanding was, donated $140 million to a fund to help Iraq and Afghan veterans. We got a small portion of that, but needless to say, it was enough to allow us to hire some additional help to look at what we could do. And under that Stand Up for Veterans banner, we had 5 key issues that we were looking at. Advanced appropriations for VA healthcare funding, women veterans, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and caregivers. Mm-hmm. And 3 years later, there was something passed on all of those issues. We were able to get advanced appropriations for healthcare in 2009.
And explain why that's important.
Back in October of 2013, the government shut down. Veterans were turned away from the benefit side of the house. But those veterans getting health care were able to continue to get their health care even though the government was shut down, because Congress approves the health care budget 1 year in advance. So it had already been approved the year before. So when they couldn't come to terms on that year's budget at the end of September, the VA funding had already been approved. The VA was able to continue the programs through the hospital, and veterans were able to get their health care benefits. That shutdown lasted, God, I forget how many days now, almost maybe 2 weeks.
Too long.
Had it gone a little bit longer, our disability compensation checks and pension checks and education checks would have been put in jeopardy. At the end of last year, we were able to get advanced appropriations for the mandatory side of VA's house, the benefit side. Right. So now, if the government was shut down again, veterans would continue to get health care. They would continue to get their checks. So those worries are taken care of. We haven't been able yet to keep the benefit side of the house funded 1 year in advance, but we're working on that. Women veterans, we were able to expand the services that women veterans were able to get. And we got some provisions for traumatic brain injury, as well as for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then the other key thing was the caregiver provisions. Now, our thought was it should apply to all generations of veterans. There shouldn't be a distinction. If a veteran was, wounded or injured during World War II and needs a caregiver, they should be entitled to that just the same as current veterans. Unfortunately, because of the costs, Congress decided that they would limit it to post 9/11 veterans. They looked at it more as a transitional type of benefit. Okay. That these veterans coming home with these conditions that needed caregivers, be good for them to be cared for in the home. So they provided stipend, respite care, and if a caregiver didn't have insurance, they get their health care now through CHAMP VA, which is similar to TRICARE. It's through the VA program, but it's more of an insurance program than an in-house care. So those 5 areas move forward. We continue to fight to try to expand the caregiver bill for all generations. We'll see how that goes.
Okay. So another thing I've heard again and again, and I guess I'd like to hear from you, do you consider yourself a ladies' man?
Why?
Well, I've just heard that when some people see you, you can just make them swoon just on sight alone.
Well, I don't know who's telling you those stories, and it's not true.
Well, tell us about how did it work with the speaker?
Most people, I don't think most people realize, because she's been vilified.
Right.
But when she became the minority leader in 2003, in 2003, first thing she did, or one of the first things she did, was she gathered a group of veterans come in. It was a small room. She stood at a podium and talked to us about the importance of veterans. And I left there along with a couple colleagues, and it was like, this is nice. It was nice that she did it, because no other leader, whether Democrat or Republican, had done that before. But she's in the minority. What can she do? She can say anything she wants to say, and then point the finger at the other side and say, they won't let me do it. But she continued to have those meetings on a quarterly basis, and they began to expand. And not only, did she call in the veterans, but she called in the military organizations, and then the family members, and then the survivors organizations. And so the meetings became bigger. And not only was it, her standing up there talking to us, but then she invited in her leadership, the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, the chairman of Appropriations, chairman of the subcommittee on appropriations and the budget. And they would talk to us. And actually they would listen to us. That was one of her things, was she wanted to hear from us. And then when she became speaker, without any push from anybody, the prior Congress had kicked over the budget. It was a continuing resolution from the end of what was that, 2007 maybe, but they couldn't agree on a budget, so they kicked it over. She was then Speaker of the House. The Democrats were in charge. She managed to add an additional $3.1 billion to VA in the continuing resolution that Congress extended for the rest of that year. So we got exactly what we've been asking for in the independent budget. A couple months later, there was a supplemental for the war. We got another $1.8 billion for VA. She continued to have her quarterly meetings while she was Speaker of the House, which is unheard of. And to this day, she continues to have those quarterly meetings with the veteran service organizations, the military organizations, and survivors and family members. And we saw results during her leadership as Speaker. We saw increases, substantial increases in the funding for VA and how veterans were taken care of, and that's how that came about.
Did you ever let her know that you might have been a little dubious when she first started presenting, as far as where it would take her?
Actually, at the last roundtable we had, which was about a month ago, I did mention it because she announced that I was retiring, and I wanted to take the opportunity to thank her for doing this since 2003, and I did mention the fact that at that time, it's like nice. Again, I don't want to detract from it, because, like I said, no other leader, whether Democrat or Republican, has met with us on a regular basis. No other speaker, I don't think, is even willing to meet with us for the most part. But she's done it, and it's great. I don't know what her motivation is, but she certainly has been there for veterans, the military, and their families. And I think even my most conservative colleagues agree that they believe that she's sincere in what she's doing, and it's not just a political scheme.
Right. Well, I had one more question, or just from the different people I've spoken with, they mentioned how you called it like you saw it, even though you were in a politically delicate position. And one interesting story I heard was had to do with a call you got from Roll Call, which is a magazine, and they asked you for a grade. Remember this?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. The then chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the House, Mr. Filner, had put out a report card giving the committee all A+s in a number of different areas, and I can't remember, there must have been about 4 or 5 A+s. And so I got a call from Roll Call, and I had a pretty good relationship with the reporter. We had done a number of stories over the years together, and he called me up and wanted to know my thoughts. And in the back of my mind, it's like, boy, do I lie and say, okay, it's a B, or I give him an A-, or should I be honest? Well, I kind of took the middle ground. Instead of giving him the D or F that I thought he actually deserved, I gave him a C-, which didn't set very well with the chairman or his staff. And in fact, it was followed pretty rapidly by a letter complaining about his handling of the appropriations, the committee's views and estimates. Because for years, he had sat up there and waved the independent budget around and told the other side when they were in charge, this is the budget, this is the veterans budget, you should be paying attention to this. Well, his first year as chairman, he ignored the independent budget. He came in below the amounts in there. And again, I mean, I don't look at who they are or what their party affiliation is. It's what are they doing for veterans? And he wasn't doing what I wanted him to do. And a letter went over, to him indicating our displeasure with how he's handled the budget situation. So, I try to look at it from without being too abrasive, but you want to also let them know what you're truly feeling.
Right. Well, I think we're close to running out of time, but one thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is you had mentioned how you stood vigil at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial back in, I think it was 83, 84, for POWs or MIAs. Speak to the experience you got to have in the mid-90s with the delegation.
It was the POW-MIA issue that got me involved in veterans organizations. I was not aware at the time that we had a large number of missing from the Vietnam War. There were at that time about 2,100, and so it was something that was very important to me, that issue. And in, I think it was 97, I had the opportunity to be on a presidential delegation to go back to Vietnam. Deputy Secretary Herschel Gover was in charge of that delegation. There were people from DOD, people from State Department. We went back, spent two nights in North Vietnam in Hanoi, which was a weird feeling. Landing at the airport, seeing the NVA flag flying, knots in your stomach. It was interesting, though, that the people were very friendly. I was impressed with that fact. On the street, people were friendly. I think it probably had a lot to do with they wanted American money. But, I didn't feel any hatred or any resentment. When I talked to the State Department folks about it, one of the things that they said, and I don't know if it's true or not, was the people there believed that the United States could have destroyed that city. I mean, we could have bombed Hanoi, back into the Stone Age, and I think that was talked about, but we didn't. And so there was some appreciation for that fact. The other thing that was interesting was you didn't see any disabled people or disabled veterans on the streets in Hanoi, and I was told they were all shipped down south. They didn't want a reminder of the war up there. But, we met with high-level delegations. The most frustrating part of that, though, was our government had just put together a review of all of the roughly 1900 missing in action at that point, and categorized them. And there was a group of about 55 that were last known alive. Those were individuals that they knew were in the hands of the communist government, but were never returned. And I thought what we should have been doing was talking to them about those cases. We only gave them 2 and really didn't discuss it. It was just handed to them for them to tell us, what happened to these folks. And the best they could do was to say, well, when we transferred people from one camp to another, your bombers came along and bombed. They killed our people. They killed your prisoners of war. We don't know what happened to any of them. And they were more interested in talking to us about helping them with the residuals of Agent Orange and helping them recover their almost 600,000 missing from the war. So it was very frustrating to see that. And at the same time, our government under Clinton was moving forward with normalization of relationships with Vietnam. While we were there, I think the ambassador, Pete Peterson, former prisoner of war, was named the first ambassador since the war. And so it was frustrating to see that part of it, to feel that, we could have accomplished more, we should have accomplished more. And in fact, the DAV, the American Legion, and the families of POW MIAs wrote a dissenting opinion to a report that Herschel Gober put out because of our concerns about what the government was doing.
Did you ever go down to South? Were you close enough to where you had served?
No, we never went south. We only spent 2 nights in Hanoi. Then went to Laos for a night, and then out along the Ho Chi Minh Trail where they were doing some excavations, and then down into Cambodia for half a day, but never got to South Vietnam.
Is there a 3rd trip to Vietnam in your future?
Boy, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Huh.
Although the beaches are beautiful, but who knows? I don't see it.
Well, I appreciate you sitting with us. I don't know. Let's see, are there questions?
There were a couple comments, I think, here. You might want to just look through them quickly here, but some fairly specific questions about different issues.
If I could add something, while you're looking at that, is I'd just like to let these listeners know, because I'm sure they're probably interested in the markup that's going to happen this week in the DAMA subcommittee. They're going to be marking up H.R. 800, which is expedited appeals, and the chairman's bill, chairman of the full committee, Chairman Miller, H.R. 1379, which is the no remands by the board. It will be all developed in-house. But those 2 bills are coming up for markup, which is a good sign. Means they'll be moving forward in some fashion or another. I'm not sure how you kind of mesh a temporary pilot program that's going to do development at VA at the same time, or at BVA, same time you're doing a full-blown, no more remands. But that's on the horizon for this week. Your listeners may want to keep their eyes open to see what happens to those bills as they move forward.
Yeah, I'll put up a news I get on that to the blog. But all right, Joe, well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us, and we wish you the best come next month when you look to move on from here.
Well, thank you, Matt. You're one of the greater guys that I've met practicing before the court.
Well, thanks.